Hi everyone, and welcome to the 16th edition of the Disruptive Fridays, and actually the first one for 2021. The edition started in the beginning of the lockdown in April, and in the meantime developed as our online program series, with this being its 16th edition already. Since October, it is also funded by the European Cultural Foundation, which luckily keeps us going now until the first half of the year. In the beginning here, I would really like to thank Rana Fadikari from the Boiling Head Media for the production of these editions from the very beginning, and the whole Disruption Network Lab team that is basically backing us in every edition. Today, for the first time, as a moderator from our team, we have Alannah Travers. She joined our team in October 2020 as our digital communications manager. She has experience working in various activist organizations in the UK and is also the chair of the Labour Campaign for Human Rights. Before moving to Berlin, she worked in political comms in London. So, Alannah, the floor is yours, and I'm really, really excited to hear what you have prepared today.
Thanks, Alannah. Hi all. Welcome to the first episode of 2021. Today's topic is incredibly timely, and it's such a huge delight to be joined by the award-winning investigative journalist and author of two brilliant books, Tom Burgis, to unpack the opportunities that the pandemic has provided for kleptocracy to flourish, and also to understand more about what it is and how it works and why we should care. This is a great conversation to kick off the year with. In March, and I've been told to do a little plug, our 23rd conference, titled Behind the Mask, will be covering all things whistleblowing during the pandemic, specifically in healthcare systems, but I'm sure we'll also touch upon the rollout of vaccines across Europe. But what better place to begin today than with the corruption we've witnessed over the past year? Across the world, we've seen dramatic increases in government spending, logistical obstacles for watchdogs monitoring kleptocratic financial flows, and a ready-made, in some ways excusable, but also a manipulated excuse for freedom of movement and political protest. I've been incredibly struck by how the exposing of power and unfair distribution of money, and particularly public money, has almost become the secondary issue of the pandemic, at least for those of us lucky enough to not be directly impacted by the very real health implications. So I'm greatly looking forward to speaking with Tom about the impact of COVID-19 on the other crisis of dirty money and kleptocracies, and what we can learn from it and what we can do. Tom is a complete expert in this field. For full disclosure, he's also my cousin, and his second book, Kleptopia, How Dirty Money is Conquering the World, was published in September 2020, exposing hidden connections and stories from the world of kleptocracy, from the former Soviet Union to Africa, to London, and to Washington. And I'm really keen to discuss the book in detail too. One final thing before I hand over to Tom, this is being live streamed on Facebook and YouTube and on our website. We'd really love your questions. We'll have a Q&A at the end, but I'd also like to ask them all the way through. So please, whenever you think of one, just put it in the chat box on the website, and only on the website, because if you comment anywhere else, we won't see it. And the link is disruptionlab.org/Fridays. So, Tom, over to you. Are kleptocrats the big winners of COVID-19?
Thank you very much, Alannah. Yes, we are cousins. We should declare that, given that we're talking about. I'm also slightly nervous because there's very much a trend in our family that people get brighter as they get younger, and the older parts of the family, like me, can be run rings around occasionally. So I look forward to your questions, and please be kind to me. I think this is as you say, a timely topic and a vital one, and one I think the importance of which will only grow as, with luck, the health aspect of the pandemic dwindles or is brought under greater control, and we start to realize the political and economic consequences of it, which we had to postpone, and we had to block ourselves from thinking about in the thick of it. As you say, my second book that came out in September is called Kleptopia, and it's 4 stories written like a thriller, I hope, about this world I've called Kleptopia. What do I mean by that? I mean a globalized kleptocracy, an international cross-border kleptocracy. Kleptocracy being, of course, a system of rule through corruption. So there's basically 2 categories of country, or 2 categories of rule from where I see it after a few years in South America and Africa, and now long stint on the investigations team at the Financial Times, working especially on the former Soviet Union. Essentially, you have a political system that broadly works in the interests of the collective, and you have a political system that broadly works in the interests of those who hold power. And the latter, at its sharp end, is a kleptocracy. And I think if you take a map of the world now, and you put countries in either category, what you'll start to see, alarmingly, is that an ever greater majority of the globe is covered by kleptocracy. Most of Africa, most of South America, most of Eastern Europe, pretty much all points from the Bosporus to Beijing. And I think we're going to touch on this later, but it's also very important to remember that it's not simply a case of countries being corrupt or not corrupt. What we're talking about is networks that have no respect for borders. Corruption is transnational, and kleptocracy has gone global. So in the book, that's something I really try to show, how you can draw lines from brutal acts of violence by which kleptocrats hold power, up through the political systems in someone like Kazakhstan or Zimbabwe. But then you can also see how the international financial system, the Wall Street banks, the London Stock Exchange, a whole host of former, and in some cases current, senior politicians in democracies are monetizing their careers in public service by renting themselves out to kleptocrats, essentially. I think we haven't yet reached the tipping point where the spread of kleptocracy is irreversible, but I think that point is approaching. And I also think that, with a sort of tragic irony, a lot of decisions that were probably justified and necessary in the teeth of the pandemic, have also had devastating consequences in this respect. Some of the decisions were just kind of naked self-dealing, but in some cases, it's arguable that some of the protections on, say, public spending that were stripped back in an emergency were both necessary and terribly damaging. And we can come on to, the chumocracy, as it's called in the UK, but earlier today I was just going back over some of the sort of statistics about this, about what's happened over the past year. What does a kleptocrat need? What does a kleptocrat want? They take elements, these transnational networks, they take elements of state power and elements of business power, but they take elements of economic power, where they find them, and they combine them. So, the classic example is the allegiance of a big American oil company with a kleptocrat in the Gulf of Guinea or wherever it may be, using the parts of multinational corporate power and state power that they need to enrich themselves. So you need control on state spending is the number one thing you need to be a kleptocrat, because your whole raison d'etre is to divert money from the Commonwealth to your personal interests. That's number one. And number two, you need some sort of coercive control over the population of that state. That's because there is no legitimate social contract. There will be the simulacrum of one. There will be a kind of phony state pretending to provide for the people, but in reality, what you have is a kleptocracy that is doing the very opposite of that. So you need a means of control. Now, that's either through coercive control, as I say, through surveillance, violence, hijacking of the monopoly on force, and so on. Or it's through subtler things such as manipulating ethnic hatreds, demonizing an other so that you can create a kind of loyalty to yourself that's based on fear. And surveillance in either case is a key part of this. And if you look at what COVID's done, it's turbocharged both of those crucial aspects of a kleptocracy. One through across the world, and as I made clear, these kleptocratic networks, they run from the richest cities in the world to the poorest. Across the world, the protections that we've fought for over centuries in order to guard over the stewardship of the Commonwealth, of our collective resources, they've been ditched with incredible speed and lack of conversation. So essentially the rules like competitive tendering for public contracts, which can seem arcane and dull, and in some cases it is, but as a rule, as a tool for giving us as a collective control over how power is used in our name, these are among the most important tools, right? Power is money, and this is state money being spent. The OCCRP, which I'm sure you're familiar with, they have done phenomenal work on this, and they're what is it? The Organised Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. They've done fantastic work, and I'd really recommend their site for news coverage of the Slovenian approach or the Estonian or whatever it may be to this problem. They did some brilliant analysis. I've got the number here in my notebook. The vast majority of the top 1% of most valuable contracts within the whole of the EU, the vast majority of all those contracts were done with no open bidding whatsoever. So this is massive, society-changing amounts of money going out with very little oversight, and we're only beginning to understand the consequences of that and the way that has been abused. Again, corruption so often latches onto our human frailties. That's what it feeds on. It feeds on the greed and the weakness that we all have within us. That's why we build these institutions to guard against the darker angels of all of our natures. And you can see emerging examples of how in what are otherwise really well functioning democracies, often well-meaning attempts to find solutions to the pandemic, such as, my brother, he knows how to do this stuff. Chuck him the contract. That it can be from a place of innocence and honesty and good faith, but as we break down these systems to protect against corruption, we're going to find them very hard to build back up again. We can absolutely come to that. There are tons more examples from around the world, but I just want to talk a little bit quickly about the other side of this. So that's access to state funds, critical for kleptocratic networks, and the second part is some form of control over populations. And I'd say the most staggering example on that front is in Hungary. So Viktor Orban fits into that classic category of kleptocrat, where we all focus on the nationalism, we all focus on the xenophobic, or in his case, anti-Semitic rhetoric. We all worry about kind of neo-fascism. It was the same with a lot of the discussion of Trump. It's the same with a lot of the discussion of what are other examples? Duterte in the Philippines is a good one. Obviously, Putin has used this trick with his cozying up to the Orthodox Church. As his kleptocracy has got more rapacious, so is his kind of pseudo-nationalism. You see it with the ultra-corrupt Chinese system and the demonization of the Uyghurs and Xi's revival of a lot of kind of Maoist memes. And often we fixate on this, but actually what we're looking at is a kleptocracy that's using the tricks of nationalism to create loyalty, to create subservience, to create fear. And Orban is the most spectacular example of this, well, at least close to where we're talking. And he was one of the very first to move at the start of the pandemic to use the pandemic as a pretext to assume the most astonishing powers of decree, without which his regime had already managed to embroil itself in all manner of corruption. I'd also point to you. Well, actually, you covered, Alannah. We can come back to, if you want, the restriction on protest. the pandemic has also done in poorer countries. Obviously, it's an opportunity to bring in massive quantities of extra multilateral donations. And there's another really good OCCRP bit of reporting on Kyrgyzstan, sort of organized crime riddled kleptocracy out in the Central Asia. Looking at sort of $600 million of funding for their anti-pandemic policies, their policy response, with as far as some of which is coming from aid, over which there appears to be almost zero oversight. And Kenneth Roth of Human Rights Watch, he had a good line about this. He says the comparison to look at is 9/11 and the extent to which a huge shock to the global consciousness, if you like, was used to very, very quickly amass massive powers. And he rightly raises the question about why and how would states ever give those, would ruling elites ever give those powers back? And what's crucial to remember in all of this is that we often think that the real cost of money going missing is that somebody who shouldn't have a yacht has a yacht, or somebody who shouldn't be at a private school is their daddy nicked a load of money. And it's true that these things happen, and it's true that they're unjust. But what I've really tried to show in the book, and I'm just going to finish by reading a couple of paragraphs of it, is that kleptocracies increasingly, wherever you are, they can reach into your life. The protections we have against this kind of raw, untrammeled power are being dangerously eroded, and we're not paying enough attention to that. And in the course of reporting the book, I did a couple of trips to Kazakhstan, relatively hair-raising trips, and one of the stories, the most moving story I heard, was that of Rosa Tuletieva, who was an oil worker in a godforsaken part of the steppe near the Caspian Sea. She works out in the desert, helping to pump oil on which the global economy still runs. And Rosa was a member of a trade union, and she went on strike over corruption and the diversion of oil workers' pay, their working conditions, kind of things unions are there to do perfectly legitimately. And the upshot of this strike several months later, on Independence Day 2011 in December, was that security forces opened fire on a peaceful protest, killing a dozen people. Rosa wasn't one of the people who was shot dead in the square. But what happened afterwards was what happens in kleptocracies, which is information warfare. So kleptocracies have a double existence, trying to project a legitimate face and behind which they're operating arbitrary power. This is what happened to Rosa when she tried to make a report about what she'd seen in the square. Men in plain clothes walked Rosa to the detention center and down a corridor with doors leading off on each side. They led her to what she took to be a commander's office. There she was shown a list of her relatives. She was questioned again and again, men shouting at her, but she didn't understand what answers she was supposed to give. One of the men had a scar on his face and a malevolent air. Ruslan was his name. He came towards her carrying a plastic bag. He whipped it over her head and pulled it tight. She gasped for air, but none came. At last, Ruslan released the bag. Rosa felt her head swim. Then suddenly the bag was back on, her body writhing in panic. Again, Ruslan asphyxiated her, and again and again. When the bag split, he went off to find another. His colleague took over. He slapped Rosa's face, grabbed her neck. He seized a fistful of hair and dragged her from her seat. When they took her back to her cell, she tried to tidy herself. As she composed her hair, a clump of scalp came away in her hand. The torture of Rosa goes on in more and more horrendous ways. And she's haunted by she clearly has PTSD of some form. She's haunted by the ghosts of her dead friends and colleagues. And then the moment arrived when fear took Rosa completely. In the interrogation room, they crowded round her and spoke her daughter's name. They go on to make nightmarish threats against her daughter. She would have done anything to protect her daughter. She wanted to protect everyone. Others could betray her if they needed to, if it would keep them out of here. By any means, truth or lie, let them not end up here, she thought. She would have done anything. But she did not know what it was she was supposed to do, to say. What had happened, she thought. And you can read in the book what becomes of Rosa, but I don't think it's too much of an exaggeration to say that as our norms that protect us against corruption are broken down by the COVID pandemic, it's wise that we pay attention to what lies at the extreme end of a system that's based on personal enrichment rather than stewarding the collective interest. There you go. There's some thoughts. Now, please go easy on me, Alannah.
Very much, and I remember when I read the book being really moved by Rose's story in particular. So, thanks for reading that, and yeah, really great overview as well on the impact of our response to coronavirus on the kleptocracies, essentially. Very convenient timing, but yesterday, Transparency International published their Corruption Perceptions Index Report 2020. Bit of a mouthful, and I hope I think Lika's going to share a link to the chat on the website so people can read it in more detail. And essentially it looked at the actual at the impact of corruption on the ability of countries to respond effectively and democratically to the pandemic. So it's perfectly timed for what you just sort of spoke about. Interestingly, not surprisingly, the results showed that countries with high levels of corruption were least prepared to deal with the COVID-19 crisis, and obviously, it makes sense. Persistent corruption in public sectors worldwide has deeply fueled the pandemic by weakening healthcare systems, wasting government spending, threatening institutions needed to protect public interest. For context, very quickly, before, just for people who might not have read the report, so Denmark and New Zealand score top with 88 points. At the bottom were Syria, I think Somalia and South Sudan. The UK, for those who might be interested, scored joint 11th with Hong Kong. So it's all slightly, and maybe we can discuss this, these high-scoring, clean countries actually do play a very crucial role in facilitating corruption elsewhere. But nonetheless, the report offers a good sort of starting point to look at corruption within countries. And I do recommend reading it. But I guess maybe we can go into a conversation about corruption or democracy in the UK, and I've got some stats on that. But is it even a helpful way to approach the global, kleptocracy? I suppose the answer's in the definition that it's a global problem, not, in a list. But yeah, it'd be good to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, very true. I think that's an important point. I come to the corruption perceptions index. I wanted to run a quick straw poll past the people who are posting comments here. There's a number. I'd be very interested to see what everyone thinks this number is. There's a percentage I looked up earlier of all COVID contracts issued by the UK, all of them. So it's about $18 billion worth. There's what percentage of all those contracts has been issued in competitive tendering? So for what percentage was there an open competition where companies could apply and they would respond to a tender document and they would say, okay, this is our company, this is our track record, this is what we think we can do the contract for, and there was a competitive process. We'll come back and reveal the answer at the end of this comment. But on the Corruption Perceptions Index, first of all, it's important to say two things. One is it's a perceptions index, right? So if you live in a country that's cleaner, it's legitimate that that country would be higher up the index. It is undoubtedly you can live a life less blighted by corruption if you're born in London than if you're born in Luanda. That is certainly true. It's also true that Transparency International is a magnificent organisation that's done a huge amount of polling work like that and also investigative work, and has hugely helped. I'd say in the way that say Friends of the Earth has done magnificent similar investigative work on the environment. Transparency International done tremendous work in expanding our consciousness of what corruption is, which can often be quite hard to pin down, and how it works. But the big problem with that index is it can, to a casual reader, give the impression that corruption is sort of culturally inherent to, let's say, Nigeria or Kazakhstan, or Bolivia, or wherever it may be. And you think that through for 20 seconds, you realize it's obviously complete nonsense. Corruption isn't sort of generically or culturally inherent anywhere. It's present wherever there is human frailty and greed, and it's simply a question of the strength of the institutions that you can develop to resist it. Now, you rightly say that the rich democracies are at the top of that index, but you go back through. There's a brilliant resource on this, which is the U.S. Department of Justice's archive, and they have all the judgments and filings from the big corruption cases. All the big corruption cases are really done in the US because they have by far the best anti-corruption law, and they also have by far the best funded, in fact, probably the only well-funded prosecution unit in the world to go after corruption. And you go back through case after case, and the engines of corruption in all of these cases are enormous multinational companies listed on the New York Stock Exchange or the London Stock Exchange or elsewhere in Europe, whether it be Airbus, or Shell, Halliburton. It's a long list, and off they go to Nigeria, to other parts of Africa, to parts of the former Soviet Union, and it's pretty well documented in these settlements, the bribes that they pay. Who's more at fault there, the bribe payer or the bribe taker? I think it's maybe moot really to try and pass that blame. You'd have to look at the individual characters and the individual circumstances, but it's certainly taking two to tango, is my point. And that the corruption is not in my mind, a phenomenon that's connected to a particular place or culture. As I say, it's waiting to pounce anywhere. That's my previous book, The Looting Machine, was kind of about this. How about a lot of, in my view, a lot of the corruption that is absolutely rife in Africa, ruining African lives, is essentially imported through the oil and mining industries. So that would be the context I think we should see, in which we should see that report. And obviously these trends are only accelerated by the government response to the pandemic. Oh, and quickly, I should give the number, shouldn't I? So what proportion of UK COVID contracts have been subject to proper tendering? Okay, Rachel says 4%, actually 10%, 15%, 20%, naught, 30%, 10%. Okay, the answer is 1%.
Wow, gosh. Everyone was quite close.
1%. Wow. So only 1 in 100 contracts had the basic rules applied to them, that by which we make sure that the government is spending money in the common interest. And no minister will ever be able to tell you that they, without any institutional checks, have the power or have the competence to make that kind of decision. That's what the institutions are there for.
Brilliant. And it's the opportunity as well, right? Which is essentially what coronavirus shows us even more. Just to bring it back specifically to COVID for a second, just continuing with the report. And actually, I think it might be a point worth making that even in the higher scoring corrupt countries, and I actually don't know if Somalia or South Sudan have suffered a greater coronavirus death rate than many of the cleaner countries in the West, but they haven't. We've all had we've all had in the West a fair share of COVID corruption, especially kind of a lack of transparency in public spending, emergency laws rolled out. I mean, I'm thinking specifically in the UK here, I'm afraid, without parliamentary scrutiny or even approval. But just to bring it back to what you were talking about with contracts, I guess, to be honest, this is now totally outdated because it's pre-corona, but I did read a brilliant statistic from the report this afternoon that according to the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, approximately 10 to 25% of all money spent on procurement globally is just lost to corruption. And in the EU, 28% of health-related corruption cases are related specifically to the procurement of medical equipment. So this is it's a very hot topic, and it's a very clear example of where just completely ripping up rules and kind of not exactly becoming a lawless state, but not abiding by corruption regulation is actually incredibly damaging, and particularly in a health emergency. And I will just read this quickly because the UK actually does get a very specific shout out in the report. And I quote for, excuse me, I can't see my screen anymore, for serious corruption risks related to the procurement of healthcare materials and personal protective equipment, with the government purchasing these goods from companies that had no prior experience in producing them, but which had close links to the ruling party, either through political campaign contributions or family ties. And I would probably say, and I'm sure you'll agree, this is a little bit more charmocracy than kleptocracy, but it's a very slippery slope, and we can see it as well with the rollout of vaccinations. And someone's asked a great question, I think we'll have to cover. Can UK citizens thank the kleptocrats re-vaccine procurement? It's a very real issue. We've got to make sure COVID-19 tests are not sold to the highest bidder. Frontline health workers have legitimate, sufficient protection from credible companies that know how to make this equipment, and then also that quarantine measures apply to all and not just those with the agency or ability to pay bribes or use their positions to totally ignore the rules. So I'm kind of waffling on here, but I think, and you made the point in your introductory sort of speech, that it's a very slippery slope, and the charmocracy kind of, well, whilst it might not turn into the kleptocracy, it certainly doesn't enable it, but it's hard to
these things are, there's no firm line. Yeah, there's no firm line, is there, between the two? I mean, we also have a problem with vocabulary. I don't think if the same fact pattern, as prosecutors say, if the same fact pattern that we've seen in the UK was taking place in the Democratic Republic of Congo, we wouldn't call that a charmocracy. We'd call that extreme corruption. Now, yes. I'm not suggesting that COVID has turned the UK into a raging kleptocracy. That would obviously be ridiculous. But there is no firm boundary between these two things. It's just a question of societal norms that we've been lucky enough to build up in certain places, which in most of the world has essentially been ruined by empire and the Cold War. So most countries for most of the last 200 years have been run by someone else, and that's either through empire or through the client-state relationships of the Cold War. And the simple technique through which you do that, and I talk about this a lot in The Looting Machine, is you combine political and economic power in the same elite, and you make them dependent on you as the outside power. So that's exactly the opposite of the principle of democracy, which is that you separate political and economic power. Democracies only work because the people who have all the money don't have all the power, in theory at least. And the great scandals of democracy, cash for questions in the UK, or lobbying scandals, or a lot of essentially the entire Trump presidency, are all come down to this question of the endless struggle of money to buy power and the endless struggle of democratic institutions to resist that. Now, it's just a sliding scale from a charmocracy through to a kleptocracy. A kleptocracy being a system where corruption has stopped being an aberration and become the norm. Obviously, we're not there, but it is deeply troubling. We're already living in a country where several major donors to the ruling party, I'm in London, but this is a problem across the rich democracies, and it's certainly a problem in Germany too. We're living in countries, and I'll come back to the UK, where the major donors, or certainly a large number of the major donors to the ruling party, are people who have known connections to the KGB. I mean, if you stand back from that, we understand the KGB now to be simply an arm of a kleptocracy. Anyone who's paying attention understands that. Several major donors, one of them recently ennobled to the Conservative Party, have personal or family or business connections to the KGB, the intelligence arm of the world's most aggressive and virulent kleptocracy. That is insane. That this is not causing more alarm. And when you add to that the breakdown of norms on anti-corruption checks caused by COVID, when you look at the sheer volume of money that's laundered through the City of London and the London Stock Exchange, when you look at the fact that 10 years of austerity have hollowed out organisations like the Serious Fraud Office that are our defences against kleptocratic money, and that doesn't look like a tomocracy to me. It doesn't look like a raging kleptocracy either, but it looks like something deeply troubling.
Thank you. It is deeply troubling, which is why I encourage people to read your book and to start caring about this issue. And because actually, I did want to make this point that I've never really known an awful lot about widespread global corruption, and I've always been touched more by personal stories and specific examples of injustice. And I think this is why, and I'd like to ask you a question about the book, why it's such a call to arms, because you read it and certain stories touch you. There's a fantastic whistleblower called Nigel Wilkins, who I so admire, and he's a real sort of key character in the book. And I kind of, although the book isn't exactly, it's not necessarily solutions focused. It's written like a thriller. It's a non-fiction thriller, and it's very clever in the way that I think it will attract lots of people to pick it up. You do leave thinking this completely has to change. And I've seen a few questions in the chat about kind of what can ordinary people do, otherwise I leave with a sense of sort of helplessness, or what's another question there, what can we be pushing for as activists or interested people? I guess I'm trying to combine two different questions, which perhaps is doomed to fail, but this is the way we enact change, right, isn't it? It's by telling people's stories. And help me out here. Why did you?
No. I see what you're saying. That the storytelling part of it is really is vital. I mean, there's a Hannah Arendt quote in the book, which is to paraphrase wildly and probably bend its meaning slightly, is about the sheer importance of storytelling in the conduct of power. It's from the I'm going to get it actually. It's from the on the origins of totalitarianism. If I could find it in my own book, there's two reasons to tell the book like a non-fiction novel. The first is that a lot of the writing about kleptocracy and corruption, and I include in this, unfortunately, some of the Panama Papers reporting, which was a brilliant feat, but did fall into this trap at points, is that no one wants to read about a load of front companies. Really, no one. I mean, not even journalists like me are obsessed with this stuff. I mean, it is unreadable. It's also a deliberate trap, right? This stuff is meant to be bewildering. It's meant to be off-putting. Yeah. It's meant to be confusing. It's meant to. Really, it's the center of its nature, and you've put the question very well. The core of what it's trying to do, of what financial secrecy and financial obfuscation is meant to do, is blind you to the story, is to remove any trace of human beings doing things, in order to allow them to do those things with impunity and secrecy. I mean, go and read. I mean, I fear to recommend this because it's not very entertaining. But go and read some market statements on the London Stock Exchange. They're all online every day, hundreds of them. I mean, they are absolute bullshit, most of them. There are very few human beings named. There's an awful lot of offshore companies doing things and saying things. I mean, this is it's a fantasy. Obviously, we have this kind of metaphorical discourse in business a lot, and some of it's valid. But essentially, what it's doing is disguising the stories that are really happening. I found the Hannah Arendt quote here. Before mass leaders seize the power to fit reality to their lies, their propaganda is marked by its extreme contempt for facts as such. For in their opinion, fact depends entirely on the power of the man who can fabricate it. And so the idea with telling a book like this is to just tell some stories, is to find the human beings behind all this stuff. So Nigel Wilkins, as you mentioned, a kind of contrarian, difficult, awkward, shy, lovable in his way banker from Basingstoke, which is a pretty unforgettable place in southern England. A pretty forgettable, rather, place in southern England. Nigel, who stumbled on the secrets of a Swiss bank and what befell him, he's our kind of everyman in this book. And then there's Peter Salas, who's a kind of idealistic Canadian liberal lawyer who starts to take on oligarchs from the kleptocracies as clients, and the moral dilemma that creates for him in the world that pulls him into. Then there's Felix Sater, who is the most extraordinary mercurial character. So he's one of Donald Trump's business partners, but he's also a guy who assaulted a man in a bar called the Rio Grande in the middle of Manhattan with a broken margarita glass, went to jail, came out, became a money launderer for the mob, Italian and Russian, and then got pulled into the world of espionage with contacts in Russian intelligence, where he was born, and American intelligence, where he grew up, and then ended up doing enormous business deals with Donald Trump, and becomes this extraordinary figure on this membrane between the democratic world and the kleptocratic world, and how the two bleed into each other. Excuse me. And then the last one is Mashkevich, is the one of the billionaires, one of the great oligarchs of the former Soviet Union, who's one of the owners of this corporation ENRC, which is says it's never done a thing wrong, but is the target of the probably the highest stakes corruption investigation in the UK, and one that's going to be an absolute bellwether for how the UK deals with business interests from kleptocracies. So the reason to tell it like that is partly to make people want to read it. After the model of the greatest of the non-fiction novels is the In Cold Blood by Truman Capote, but I don't dare suggest that it reaches those heights or comes close. But I hope it is a read that makes you turn the pages.
Okay, thank you, Tom. And actually, something that struck me there as well is just linking it back to COVID. Now we have all slightly in our own ways been awoken to what corruption and the sort of the stories in Kleptopia, which by no means resembles sort of our most our own lived experiences. We are much more alert to them, and I think just linking it back to the question, it's good to be aware of it, and human stories really do help
that is absolutely a potential sort of silver lining of the pandemic, is that we're much more aware that basically the difficulty with stirring political will against corruption is that the victims are generally a long way away, or they have been traditionally. They're in Eastern Congo, they're in the diamond fields of Zimbabwe, they're people like Rosa in places we struggle to pronounce. And now, but it's certainly coming closer. I mean, the Skripal murder, the Litvinenko murder, the deaths of witnesses in UK corruption cases, and so on. The terror of kleptocracy, the violence with which it holds power, that is coming closer to our ordinary lives. But we haven't really grasped that yet. But I think with COVID, what you see is every ballsed up contract, or every contract that's given out to some under the chumocracy that fails to deliver, that's, if not more deaths, it's perfectly plausibly more deaths, but it's certainly a longer pandemic and more lockdown and more grief. And we're starting to understand what it's like to live in a place where public spending is essentially a kleptocratic game to curry favor and to enrich the holders of power. For sometimes for the best of intentions, that is the effect of COVID procurement. And we're starting to see how living in a place like that has a real effect on your everyday life. I mean, every Nigerian has been able to tell you this for the last 60 years. But we're getting maybe a little taste of the direct connection between our ability to control corruption or the abuse of public funds and the quality and security of our daily life. So absolutely, the political will about the bigger questions of global kleptocracy, I think, is sharper for us than it would otherwise have been.
I think if we all take one thing away from the response to COVID-19. It is just that, it's the illustration of the need for integrity in the management of cases and government. I mean, just government. So I guess that's been positive in a darkly negative way. So we are getting quite a lot of questions through, which I feel like it would be great to put to you. I wanted to ask you so much more about the book, which I sort of feel like I worded slightly wrongly.
No questions. Let's have questions.
Okay. Well, it would also be nice to talk about. Okay. Questions. Let's do questions. Okay. So Tatiana says. Let's see, she's asked a few. Tatiana. Okay, kind of a conceptual question. Would you define kleptocracy as informed by corruption, or the other way around? It would be interesting to describe the difference between corruption in general and kleptocracy and oligarchy specifically, and how they influence each other in concrete ways. That's a really interesting question.
Yeah, I can give a simple answer to that, which is how I see it. So corruption is any act where public office or public trust is abused for private gain, and kleptocracy is a system of power built on corruption. It's as simple as that, I'd say. And an oligarchy is just essentially the kleptocratic regime's business wing.
Mm-hmm. Okay,
that's it. That could be a short one.
But of course, and I feel so uncomfortable saying, like, Western society, Western countries, or our places that we're at the moment aren't kleptocracies. But of course, we are enabling kleptocracies as well. So I suppose that's a slightly different question.
Yes, no, but that, I think that frames that. I hope that frames everything that we've talked about, is the understanding that kleptocracies really are transnational networks of powerful people with who hold economic power and hold political power. Controlling nation states is important because the engines of kleptocracy are you have to plug into the shared pot of wealth at some intersections to be able to drain it out. So you need control of state power, but absolutely you need control of multinational corporations to fill that pot. So typically through the oil and mining concessions, and you need the financial system to move that money so you can launder it and hide it. And having used lawlessness to enrich yourself, seek the protection of the rule of law in the democracies to hide that money. And then you also need, most kind of critically of all, you need what you might call the Western legitimizing industry. So you need lobbyists, PRs. There are all sorts of new aspects to this, kind of like reputation managers, they call themselves. You need private intelligence agencies. You need former prime ministers and politicians, all to create a story, to create a cover story, essentially, to create the equivalent of a front company, but for your political system. Because power is massively easier to wield in the world if everyone agrees to pretend it's legitimate.
Okay.
It's the difference between Kazakhstan that does this pretty well, and North Korea, which completely fails to do it.
Interesting. Okay. Another question, and by the way, please write in your questions if you have more, because we've started the Q&A, it seems. How do you feel things happening now in terms of procurement and corruption? How do you feel that it will influence post-pandemic times? So I suppose this question is getting at, what we're seeing at the moment is the slippery slope. Is there time to sort of pull back from it once we're all vaccinated? Hopefully, can we rectify the wrongs that we've seen?
Well, there's going to be a clear tension there, isn't there, between a political system that has gained power, typically never, even for the best intentions, and even the well-regarded political system, if the rulers of a village or a planet gain power, they don't give it back voluntarily, typically. It's the lesson of history. So on the one hand, the comparison with 9/11 is important because so many of those powers that were taken in the panic after 9/11 and then after 7/7 in the UK and so on, were justified during that panic, and the justification has long ceased, but those powers remain, typically around mass surveillance. And you could absolutely see that continuing. You could see, for example, much more untendered public spending as a result of COVID, as a result of things just not snapping back to where they were before. And you could see the pretext of the pandemic being used for that kind of cronyistic spending for a long time to come. On the other hand, the counter to that will be what we said earlier, will be that people have basically become much more aware of the impact on daily, ordinary life for everybody of corruption. And that the political will that comes from that will be very important. It's just it's those two forces bumping up against each other.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Gosh, I don't know whether this is an appropriate question. What is the most corrupt country in the developed world? And why? Slightly putting you on the spot, but a good question. Thank you, Christina.
I would say.
Really?
I mean, Italy, obviously. No, I'm joking. But
sorry, Tatiana.
I think I really kind of insist on this point that that there's a real danger in trying to assign levels of corruption to countries. Corruption perceptions within countries is a useful way of maybe the only possible way of organising a survey that, like the one we talked about earlier, which is useful, the CPI. But the corruption is borderless. I mean, by definition, the transnational corruption we're talking about operates without regard to borders. That the financial secrecy system exists in this place we call offshore, which is very much deliberately part of no state. And in fact, the whole problem really is that states, that the law enforcement mechanisms of states have stayed pretty national, and money has become global and rootless. Corrupt money and uncorrupt money and everything in between. So it would be hard to pick a country. I think if you were going to give that award, I think you'd have a strong argument that it would be the UK on these grounds, that the biggest secrecy jurisdiction is the word. So a place where, measured by amount of money, a place where you can move money around anonymously, which is the central, the key mechanism that allows corruption to happen. And the combination of the City of London plus the old bits of the British Empire, like the British Virgin Islands and so on, and the Channel Islands, if you tot all those up together, that you get the biggest secrecy jurisdiction in the world. So probably the UK gets that award, although Switzerland would be close behind it. And this is in terms of being part of global corrupt networks, as opposed to big problems within domestic systems, which would be a more difficult thing and a more subjective thing to measure. But the big one coming up on the ropes is on the rails rather is the US. There's been some couple of legislative changes recently which have been good, fighting back against this huge surge in the financial secrecy industry in the US. But that fight is nowhere near over.
Mm. Tom, you have so much material to work with for your next project, whatever it may be. Can I close by asking what you're interested in researching or working on or looking at or talking about moving forwards? I assume you're going to continue along, the themes of money laundering and global corruption. But I'd be really interested to hear what's on your horizon.
Well, yes, I'm still working on corruption, and I'm interested in how this sort of international spread of corruption is underpinned by the spread of violence. So that ranges from violence in the form of sort of greater surveillance, but through to what we're more clearly understanding through brilliant work by organisations like Bellingcat as international assassination trends. So essentially within Russia and spreading out from Russia are more people being murdered by kleptocrats, to put it very bluntly. And I think that evidence of that, from Navalny on down, is growing and terrifying. And I think really what underlies that is the terrible lesson that countries, especially like the UK, are learning, that all these years of absorbing dirty money, which a lot of the people in power just thought, well, it's dirty money, but it's still money, and frankly, we need a bit of that since the banking crisis. The lawlessness and the violence that come with that money, I think we're just starting to realise the extent to which that's permeated. And I'm also interested in the echoes between the kind of spread of kleptocracy and occupation, and what it's. I think there are a lot of echoes between, say, post-war occupation or occupations now in the Middle East and elsewhere, and the growing influence of kleptocracy on free societies, and the combination of surveillance and collaboration that's creating. So that's all pretty abstract. I'm going to have to find some better stories to tell.
Absolutely.
But that's broadly the idea. And then I have to look after my daughter, your cousin, and so on. So there's there's other things to be doing as well.
Indeed. Thank you so much, everyone, for all of your questions. And it's been really wonderful to talk to you, Tom. And I hope that people follow up on your work, because it's all out there and it's all brilliant, and it's really important. Obviously, I'm sure if you've got to the end of this conversation, you agree. It's been a real pleasure, and I'm going to hand back to Alannah in a moment, if this is the right time to do so. I think to talk about the next Disruptive Fridays. But if you've got any closing words, Tom, speak them.
Just thanks to everyone who listened. Thanks to you, Alannah, for that spirited conversation. It was an absolute pleasure.
Good. Thanks everyone for watching, and see you soon, I hope.
Thank you, Alannah. This was really, really amazing conversation. I really enjoyed listening to the two of you. And I wish we had more time to keep on discussing, but maybe next time we will. I'm pretty sure we can, invite you once again. There will be plenty of things to talk about.
Anytime.
Yeah. So, I will just continue what's next on our program. So I'm really happy to announce our next edition of Disruptive Fridays, which will be moderated by me. And it's planned to take place on the 12th of February. I will just say shortly, the planned focus is the female health, or rather the feminist perspective in medicine, and the female health as a socio-political category. We will discuss what the female researchers, artists, and scientists are fighting with for overcoming the status quo and using their research to learn more about the biological differences of women and men, but also find appropriate methodologies that lead to empowerment. So, please, I invite you to join us also for this edition. And for those of you who joined us a bit later, I just want to repeat what Alannah said in the beginning. Don't forget to follow our channels for the upcoming 23rd conference. The title is Behind the Mask, Whistleblowing During the Pandemic. So it presents acts of whistleblowing in time of coronavirus and exposes practices dangerous to public health during the pandemic. The program is also focusing on the activity of whistleblowers, scientists, journalists, human rights activists, artists, and researchers denouncing abuses and wrongdoing in the course of the COVID-19 crisis and even beyond that. So the conference and the program that is accompanying the conference, usually with the meetups and workshops, will be streamed, and it's for free from March 18th to March 21st. So that would be all from me as well. Thank you all for watching, and thanks once again, Alannah and Tom, for the exciting conversation, and then see you in 2 weeks.